All right. Hey, everyone. So my name's Molly Sowash. I work at Rural Action, got our team here, and I am going to talk a little bit about Silvopasture. I know you might not be able to see this very well, and it's post-lunch, so I'll try to keep it lively. This is more for my own notes. So I'm the Sustainable Agriculture Manager at Rural Action. And then I want to shout out my team, Katie, Beginning Farmer Outreach Specialist, Jordan, and Sarah, who are AmeriCorps members. So we are a nonprofit based in Athens County. We are a community development organization that serves all of the Appalachian counties of Ohio and formed in 1994, when I was born. So our mission is to build the region's assets in environmentally and economically sustainable ways, which is really vague, but we work across sectors. We come from the agriculture program, but we have a sustainable forestry program, environmental education, watershed restoration, zero waste, and our ag program has all kinds of initiatives to support beginning farmers, to do food access work as we work in areas with high food insecurity. And we operate a produce auction, kind of goes on. I also operate a farm, which you can't really see, but there's some flyers up there if you want to hear more, called Molly Farm. I'm a beginning farmer, so I started in 2020 with my first set of calves. Met my now fiance, who's now we're more partners in the farm over the last year as co-owners of the LLC. So we raise grass-fed and finished beef. And just in April, we planted 510 trees for Silvopasture. So going to share a little bit of research and background on what that word means, and then some of our experience in installing it. Who's familiar with Silvopasture? Okay. Is anyone actively managing Silvopasture? Okay. And who's like, what is that word you're saying right now? Okay, cool. Good, that helps. So hopefully through this little bit, maybe around an hour, and I invite this to be a conversation as well, I'd like to go through what is Silvopasture, why is it valuable, how do you implement it, and then how do you manage it? But first, we're here in Ohio, and I know we're from who's out of Ohio? All kinds, okay, lots of y'all. So where I farm is the historical land of the Shawnee, Wyandotte, and Lenape people. And I think of that because a lot of their stewardship of the land impacted the way it looks today. And in some ways, their forced removal also impacted how the landscape changed a lot. So before settlement, there were written accounts as people were exploring this area as it being open park-like forests, which is not what I think when we go through our pretty dense forests now, or wide open pasture. They noted the use of fire by native people and large grazing animals like the once existing woodland bison, wild here, as well as elk and deer. What they were describing, oh, I see, this is in the way. You might be able to see. What they were describing, those open park-like forests, was open woodlands or savannas, which were once historically prominent, and we had a landscape here that was kind of a mosaic of ecosystems, from that savanna-like setting to the open pasture to the more dense, maybe old-growth forest. Now, savannas, woodlands are almost non-existent due to either clearing for agriculture, the lack of fire, and the lack of grazing. So Ohio, this southeast Ohio corner particularly, went from having these open woodlands to being clear-cut to fuel the iron furnaces around industrialization. And then what came back is really almost overly dense forest. And so it was news to me doing a lot of research before we did our Silvopasture that the restoration of savannas is now a primary goal of a lot of conservation organizations. So the reason I'm talking about savannas is because Silvopasture mimics an open woodlands or savanna. So Silvopasture, what does that mean? Pasture we know the word for, silvo meaning trees. Simply put, it's the managed integration of trees, forage, and livestock. The important word I think in there is managed, that The same principles of managed grazing, prescribed grazing, however you want to call it, rotating, moving the animals on the landscape. That's like the foundation before you add managing trees to the mix. And I don't think you can see this, but I'll send out a slideshow later. There's a lot of great photos of Silvopasture. This is a farm in New York that's been managing it for many years with black locusts and walnuts and his black Angus cattle. So I mentioned the savanna-like system. The difference being that savannas are naturally occurring ecosystems and Silvopasture is man-made and managed. But the envisioning savanna, I think, gives you a good picture of the kind of spacing of trees, the open canopy to allow that robust forage beneath. So the original Silvopasture grazers around here were bison and elk. And so it's awesome to be, we have beef cattle, but it's awesome to be here seeing bison on this landscape. And I wanted to point out a couple other places like Battelle Darby Creek, where they're managing American bison, and land between the lakes in Kentucky. And I think they're on like 700 acres, so kind of mimicking a natural system that was once here. So there's someone out of New York named Steve Gabriel. I have a couple books I'll share with you all if you're interested in learning more. Learned a lot from him. He introduced me to the topic in like 17. He says, the foundational concepts of Silvopasture challenge our notions of modern agriculture and land use as we know it. For centuries, European colonizers of North America have engaged in practices that separate the field from the forest, and even more crazy, they separate the food from the animal. And in Silvopasture, trees, animals, and forages are integrated as a whole system that's greater than just the sum of those parts. You might be able to make out the sheep. Virginia Tech is doing a lot of really interesting research on sheep silvopasture systems, and they have an older site that was established in the early 90s. Maybe more importantly, what is Silvopasture not? It is not one tree in an open pasture. I think a lot of us can recognize when the whole herd goes beneath that one tree because they want shade. They're not grazing. They're creating a lot of compaction. And the key in Silvopasture, the key element, I guess, is distributed shade. So they're out grazing all day. It's also not just turning the animals loose in the woods and hoping for the best, especially a healthy stand. Again, they're managed and rotated regularly, and some site prep has to happen in existing woodlands before they're turned in. Any questions here before I go into why we might do this? Yeah. Yes, that's great. So why bother adding trees to your pasture or putting livestock into the woods? Why is it valuable? Number one for producers is often shade. That's why we are interested in it at our farm. But also there's increased feed opportunities with kind of free and long-term options for feed. Increased revenue. Better animal health from reduced heat stress primarily. Amazing carbon sequestration into the soil. Wildlife habitat, shelter, and it goes on. So let's look at shade. There's some interesting studies, and I can share you some research I've looked at. One of these studies looked at dairy cattle under portable shade, which they found is actually not as effective as tree shade. But even in that portable shade, they found cows with shade access were observed at the water trough 6.5 times less. And they were observed lying down more, which is a sign that they're not experiencing as much heat stress. They're not standing up to cool off. The same thing with the Virginia Tech study. The sheep were out grazing more frequently under shade versus the ones in the sun, which were spending longer standing up. Let's see what else. Feed. I am excited about this one. So Silvopasture offers alternative forms of feed that you don't have to do a whole lot to manage. The feed from the trees, like these locust leaves, things like nuts or fruits that drop from the trees and can be grazed at certain times a year. And then some farmers will use coppicing or pollarding to basically cut down branches or the whole tree, like willows that'll come back, to drop the really highly nutritious leaves for livestock. I think when I was first thinking about silvopasture, wondering like how can there be grass that's actually flourishing beneath, and that's where it comes down to the right kind of shade disbursement. But I was excited to read that there's a silvopasture site in Ireland established in 1989 that they've been studying, and they looked at it across 2 drought periods and found no reduction in grass growth because of the soil retention and that kind of microclimate. And, Ohio's recently been in this moderate drought, and our pasture's definitely stagnated. So I was excited to read that. I want to shout out a specific tree that's kind of a poster child for silvopasture feed, which is honey locusts. Those are the honey locusts with those big, like, pods, bean pods. Those pods can contain up to 30% sugar content. So they're highly nutritious, and one tree can drop 100 pounds of pods. What's cooler about them is the pods stay good on the ground, and livestock will eat them. I haven't tried it yet, but I know a farmer who just opens them up, and so they can get a smell of it and that sugary bit inside, and they learn to eat them. But unlike fruits, they don't rot on the ground. They fall in the fall when we're often starting to put hay out, and they can really supplement the feed during that time of year, even into winter. The tree does have thorns. That is the challenge. So while silvopasture is a very old practice, there's some new work being done, particularly around honey locusts, to breed the right genetics that are thornless, but still have a really big pod. Most thornless honey locusts are bred for street trees, and they don't want any thorns on them, but they also don't want pods. And so there's some more breeding to be done. I think it depends on where you are with locusts. Does anyone know the answer to that? I don't think so, but I would want to check. Yeah. So we didn't put this into our system because we don't think the genetics are quite ready. As we've heard, some people ordering them in, and then like half of them end up with thorns. Don't want that in our tractor tires. But someone who runs a company called Trees for Grazers, his name's Austin in Pennsylvania, he did some math on comparing hay and honey locust pods and found that hay might average 950 calories per pound of dry matter per acre. Honey locusts average 1,900. So, he thinks you can almost double your feed yield per acre by integrating these honey locusts into the system. I don't think it's going to get rid of our need for hay, but it could certainly offset the costs or allow us to stockpile into the winter. And just to emphasize, it's not new. This is an old book a friend of mine found that talks about the honey locust being used in the late 1800s in Long Island for cattle feed. Increased revenue. So I've talked about saving on hay. Also, the added tree crops and timber. So, for example, we have planned into our planting an eventual thinning that we can either use for timber or lumber on the farm, the black locust for fence posts, or a tree crop that maybe you're not going to let drop for livestock, but you're going to sell. And then what's exciting to me is also the average daily gain increases for livestock. So one study in Kentucky looked at stocker cattle and found that under shade, they gained almost a pound more per day. So that'll really add up. And then carbon credits. The carbon market is kind of a new and ever-changing thing. But there is a company called Working Trees that specifically pays for carbon credits for people planting trees. So it can really help offset the initial startup costs of a project for the carbon that's sequestered in those trees. So animal health, decreased heat stress. We talked a little earlier about like endophyte toxicity. that I think maybe affects cattle more than bison. But just going out, I think most of us can feel intuitively the benefits of shade for animals. Imagine going out with a large black winter coat on right now in the middle of the field. But yeah, all of the great studies that support that. And then I think animal welfare, putting our livestock in a setting that best suits them, diversifying their diet. So that increased feed, there's a lot of interesting components of tree crops or leaves. Willow is a great example. Willow is really high in tannins, which is a natural anti-parasite. And so, especially for things like sheep that struggle more with parasites, it can be a great thing to add to the pasture that they will graze. Also, it's high in salicylic acid, which is natural pain relief. Salicylic acid is in like acetaminophen. And so they've seen that livestock will actually self-medicate with willow. And then natural habitat, like the bison that were once, roaming through our woodlands. Animals beneath trees kind of just make sense. Chickens, too, are a cool example of that. Chickens are jungle fowl, and so having them that's why they roost, having them in an area. There's a guy in Minnesota who does it. I think he's trademarked the term tree range chickens. Carbon sequestration. So maybe you're familiar with a book called Drawdown. 100 scientists looked at 94 solutions to climate change, did their best to quantify the tons of carbon that they could be sequestered for each practice, and Silvopasture ranked number 11 of 94. So that mixture of tree and tree roots with those deep-rooted pasture plants sequesters a lot of carbon. And then I don't think I'll have time to go into like wildlife habit. There's some really interesting studies on certain birds that need kind of a savanna system to exist. And what's the other one? Oh, shelter. I haven't done this yet, but seen farms that have used, like some of us have pine plantations from, like on our property, CRP funded a big pine plantation. We don't really know what to do with it. It could be a great living barn for shelter through the winter. Any questions? Okay. So how do we implement it? There's kind of two approaches. One is to plant trees into open pasture. The other is to convert a woodlot, particularly a degraded woodlot. I wouldn't start with your healthiest stand of forest. So I'm going to talk a little about planting trees into pasture, then I'll go to woodlot conversion, which I have less experience with, but looked at. The biggest thing to consider with planting trees into pasture is layout. So considering alleys that your equipment can move through and mow, the size of your daily paddocks you're going to rotate through, planning for an eventual thinning, and the eventual thinning, creating the right setting for that equal shade disbursement. Maybe you'll alternate tree species, or maybe you'll have one block of persimmons that you're going to move all the chickens through when the persimmons fall. So it's up to your goals, your livestock, what your land can hold. A low-lying area might be better suited to willow, a ridge top better suited to oaks. So there's a couple examples here in Pennsylvania of a 40-foot by 7-foot planting, a 50-foot by 8-foot, and then thinking about your planning for equipment to go around the ends of the rows of trees that they call those headlands around. So there's a lot. It took us a long time to design our project. So species, to your question. There's some species I've listed here that are great for silvopasture, but by no means is this a final list. I mentioned honey locusts and persimmons, some oaks, although slower growing. We planted some wild apples, and we're excited to have the cattle grazing, eating those. Willows, as I mentioned. We also planted a hybrid poplar, which is really fast growing, so that we can see the benefits of shade while some of our slower growing walnuts and things are coming up. Black locusts, another great tree for silvopasture because they fix nitrogen. We think we'll be able to thin them in 15 to 20 years when our fence posts now may need changed out with more black locust fence posts. Mulberries, I've heard, is also really great, like high nutrient fruit, especially for chickens. And then we also planted a pitch loblolly pine. Again, fast shade, and we'll eventually thin them all out. Protection is the number one, I think, question. Putting trees in the pasture, that's crazy. So we used this tree tube that you can attach polywire directly to. And so our rows of trees now are the perimeter of our paddock. So let's see, our paddocks they're 40 feet, and in the rows, the trees are 15 feet apart. And so while you're protecting the tree, you're also getting rid of the need to put up polywire that day in that pasture. There's a fiberglass stake inside that supports the tree. And for other systems, I don't know if anyone has chickens, you can get away with a smaller tube. Some people have used barbed wire, like wrapped around the tube to keep the livestock from pressuring the tree. For us, polywire works. I think for bison, you'd probably need more strands of hot fence along the tree tubes, or for sheep, like this net fencing. Okay, that's quick on how to implement it by planting into pasture. I'll talk more about our experience in a minute. Woodlot conversion is also interesting because, like for us, we have this really degraded woodlot. Was once dairy pasture. It got pretty overused, and it's come back pretty much in invasives. And there's some persimmons and black walnuts in there. So we're excited to kind of forestry mulch around the trees and bale graze in there, eventually get water and fencing out, and have, while I love having the control to plant the species I want into open pasture, it is a little more work and money. And so this will allow us to have increase our pasture into these woodlot areas. And so, yeah, we'll need to remove the scrubby underbrush. Kind of Steve Gabriel I mentioned at the beginning, he says thin as Mother Nature would thin. Not all at once, giving it a kind of a shock to those trees, but gradually. And then removing the residual material underneath. We'll probably use a forestry mulcher, but I know people have you can push the brush into a pile and burn it, leave it as a windbreak. And then establish a good site for forages to grow through what we'll do is bale grazing. If it's a small area, maybe tarping, trampling, and then frost or broadcast seeding some forage into there. The cool thing about woodlot conversion, too, is you can use existing trees as fence posts. This is a farm in Connecticut where he's doing this. We just did it on a tree the other day. I think we're all familiar with a tree like eating over a nail or just subsuming whatever you put into it. So this model is to put a 2x4, then a washer, then a nail. And as the tree grows, it pushes against that washer and it pushes the 2x4 out so the fence can grow with the tree instead of get, subsumed into it. So that's cool because it's a fence post that sequesters carbon and lives forever. Not forever, but. Okay, and then after planting or establishing your site, how do you manage it? So there's aftercare. This is Austin in Pennsylvania, pulling up a tree tube, checking on vole damage, seeing how many trees survived, checking on the mulch. Mulch is another important thing for planting trees into pasture. Where we are in a pretty wet area, we don't have to water. We were very close to watering the other day, but then it rained. The mulch is the best thing to water your trees. Pruning, because in silvopasture, you want your shade to be high up so that it rotates around the pasture during the day. It's not that one solid piece of shade they never leave. And so pruning the limbs up the tree as it grows, rotational grazing, as I emphasized, and then an eventual thinning. Okay. So this was a little bit about our experience in April. We did all our planning through the winter. We got a grant that is still taking applications, I'll tell you about at the end, to pay for the trees and the tubes, which the tubes are the most expensive part. Our planting, as I mentioned, was 40 feet by 15, we planted the pitch loblolly pines, black locusts, black walnuts, wild apples, hardy pecans, the hybrid poplar, and the Chinese chestnut. And we found that layout is the hardest, but perhaps most important part. I think you can get into analysis paralysis, so don't think too hard about it, but definitely when you're planting these trees that are going to exist way past our lifetime, thinking about the layout, where our equipment was going to move, how to structure the tree rows so that they became the boundaries of our paddocks. For the grant, we had to project how much hours we would spend on layout, and we said we didn't put any hours in. I don't know what we were thinking. We put hours in for site prep, but just the marking where you're out in an open field and you're like trying to figure it out. It ended up taking us like a couple 8-hour days with 5 people laying out each spot. So we use these colored flags like you use for like electric dog fence, and each color was designated to one species of trees. So the pink was the pitch loblolly, and that way we could create our straight lines and mark where each tree was going to be when our volunteers came to plant. And then you don't get willy-nilly curvy rows and things like that. And I'm more of like a curvy row person. I had to get over that. For mowing and for ease of use, the lines were helpful. And then we had to plan for thinning. So for us, we're going to thin the black locusts and the pitch lobs. So we planted those species every other so that eventually it's a 40 by 30 layout when we go to thin. And what was our end goal is around, I can't remember. Yeah, I can't remember. 40 to 60 trees per acre. So we're starting with a lot more. We put 510 in 10 acres. Yeah. Another tip is just being organized on planting day. So laying out all of our supplies. Before we had a bunch of great volunteers. Katie was there helping us plant. We put a tree stake and tube at every augured hole so that there was no mistakes. We also inoculated the roots of trees in a root dip that inoculates them with mycorrhizal fungi because pastures tend to be more dominated by bacterial networks and forests by fungal networks. The mycorrhizal inoculation helped those trees get established with what they need. And then it was really helpful to just have one task per person. We had 13 people, including us, out there. So 2 people were running the tractor and augering holes. I know some people do this just with a shovel, which works too. We found augering to be helpful. And then when tree planters came to help, they had one species to plant. So it was like, go to all the orange flags with the black locusts. Less likely to mess up and also just an easier, more efficient flow. Then someone would come behind with a post pounder, which comes with the tube to pound the stake in. Someone else with the tree tubes or shelters to install. And then we ended up coming later to put mulch, 2 5-gallon buckets on the trees and install polywire along the rows. Challenges, it was very wet in April. Late March, we augured the day before most of the holes, came back to 2 feet of water filled in the holes. So we had kitchen pots. We were bailing out the holes. We've had some die. I think we haven't checked them all, but I think maybe 10% of the trees have died, which is to be expected. They won't all make it. But let's see what else. Our first 2 species arrived early. Apple and pecans. They were from Georgia, so if I were to do this again, I would make sure to source everything a more local stock. They were already leafed out, and we hadn't gotten through all of our frosts. They have, for the most part, survived and been okay, but we were worried about that. And then after that first planting, we had heavy winds, and all the tree tubes were like 45-degree angles from the ground. So we ended up having to re-stake and tube 50 of the trees. And then, this was funny. I had done research and heard from a farmer in Tennessee who, the first time she put her cattle into the area, she used a blood-scented like deterrent that you might spray on a garden for deer. Just like as a little training area for the cattle, like you really don't want to mess with these trees. There's also hot wire on it, but just like that first time they were in there. So we were like, great, we're going to do this. We put the blood deterrent all over the tubes, let the cattle in, and they like beelined it to the tubes and started licking them. They must have needed iron or something. They didn't harm the trees, but that didn't work. And then successes. We planted all the trees. That felt like a great success to us, with some great help from family and friends. And the cattle are using it well. They are respecting the fence for the most part, all but one. He likes to just go through it. And there's even parts of the tree rows where we've lifted the polywire up and kind of over the tree tubes so that they can pass under it. I thought they'd balk at that and they wouldn't go under, but they have. And they're grazing it pretty well. They're longer, more rectangular shaped paddocks, so it's not a perfect system, but they're definitely grazing and utilizing the forage well. What else? Yeah, and most trees are doing well. The Chinese chestnuts particularly are flourishing. Yeah. So when Carrie asked me to do this, I was like, I have more cattle experience, still beginner, but how could this be different for bison? So I asked her a little bit. She said some options for planting outside of the fence or along the fence row. We did do an area along the fence row, which we're excited to have. And then she has good luck with using a heavier duty temp fence, like horse tape, just making sure it's really hot all the time, because like cattle, they'll figure out when it's off. And then Austin, who installs Silvopasture on all kinds of farms, I asked about bison. He said that he spoke with a farmer recently, said that bison respect the electric fence well. What else did he say? Oh, they're just tougher than cattle. And so they may not need the shade quite as much, but that also to watch out for them being hard on the trees as they rub and itch and stuff like that. So I would imagine probably more lines of polywire along your trees if you are planting into pasture. But does, anyone else have ideas about considerations for bison and trees in silvopasture? I'll have to experiment. I wanted to find an example. This is Shephard Farm in Missouri. Dan Shephard has a pecan orchard, and added to his annual crop rotation, he added the pecans, and he also produces gamma grass seed. And for many years, he was running bison through his pecan orchard. I think they stopped because of changing regulations around processing on the farm. But yeah, one research about his place said that in pecan silvopastures, the herbaceous understory prevents soil loss, and the controlled grazing reduces mowing costs, while you have the added revenue from livestock and timber. I have a couple books with me that have been helpful. This one by Austin that's particularly good for planting trees into pasture, the model we have gone with. And then this one, which is kind of all background on silvopasture, but also has a good emphasis on woodlot conversion. Yeah, I think that's it. There's all kinds of books about trees and livestock. Any questions? Oh, wait, the grant. Our grant was through Virginia Tech, and Rural Action is a partner on it. The funder was the Edwards Mother Earth Foundation. They, I think, want to see trees planted, and Virginia Tech provides the technical assistance for how to do that and manage it as a producer. So it's called the Catalyzing Agroforestry Grant Program, and I think they're still taking applications and at least wait lists because they're interested in keeping the funding going. So I can send more information if you're interested. Okay, any questions?